Sag mit kaltem Blut, wie sich das Kindlein fand, so lang dem war zur Helle.
So, lately I've been wondering about the very broad and venerable genre of horror in film, and where it is that our first feature film, The Orchard, fits within that category. I wondered this specifically because of the reviews we've had of the movie. A few commentators lament that there is in the film relatively little horror, by which I think they mean gore, scares, jump or otherwise, monsters, etc. And that's clearly a disappointment for many horror fans. When you have an audience that's expecting one thing but that gets another, the reaction tends not to be positive, akin to ordering a hot dog and fries and getting a Cobb salad. Because there are such passionate and devoted horror film fans, you experiment with the genre at your peril. Witness Trey Shults' It Comes at Night, which at the time of its release in 2017 was not well received by horror fans or moviegoers in general. In fact, Guardian columnist Steve Rose noted it was instantly slaughtered on what was then Twitter, and its cinema score a D. Here is a film built of paranoia, guilt, grief, dread, regret, distrust, complexity, moral ambiguity, but not much in the way of standard horror fare. On the other hand, Comes at Night today has a Rotten Tomatoes score of 88% with critics, so obviously there's something else going on there. And of course that's not unusual. So often there is that chasm between critical and popular perspectives. Then there was Robert Eggers' The Witch, which Steve Rose also notes was aimed at mainstream audiences, quote, who felt they'd been conned and took to Twitter with worst movie ever sentiments. Here's a film of dread, disorientation, brooding atmosphere, and the uneasy sense that you've aligned yourself with the protagonist who isn't exactly what she seems. Again, I would not want to directly compare The Orchard with either of these two films, both of which I respect enormously. The Orchard, as our first feature film, was made so entirely outside the usual filmmaking paradigm that it doesn't compare to those other movies. It is literally zero budget picture. But what The Orchard does have in common with It Comes at Night and The Witch is that it wants to go down that same path of unease, brooding atmosphere, moral ambiguity. Yes, there's relatively little traditional horror in it, not much in the way of jump scares, only a few special effects, no monsters, some blood that seems to come from bizarre unexplained injuries. But I will also say that The Orchard investigates trauma from inside and then follows it to see how that festers into something darker. The film begins at a place of damage inside the protagonist, and it tells you only a few things about this initial trauma, that it was a car accident, that it killed his entire immediate family, that he struggled with healing and addiction in the wake of this event. It doesn't tell you who was responsible for the accident, although I think astute viewers will probably figure this out for themselves. So the monster in this case isn't some outside supernatural force. It's the monster inside the man that actually destroys everything around him, and finally himself, which is his only act of redemption. For those of you who are thinking, all of this sounds a lot like a well-known subgenre of horror, which is psychological horror. And that's true. And in fact, we've tried to market The Orchard as a psychological horror. Although once again, the fit isn't quite right. Psychological horror, by definition, deals in an unstable protagonist who suffers from delusions, moral disturbances, and trauma, and who exhibits those characteristics through paranoia, fear, etc. But in most all psychological horror films, the monster is imposed upon the protagonist. Consider The Silence of the Lambs, It Follows, Get Out. In these cases, the protagonist is, at the end of the film, still a protagonist, still someone with relative innocence despite their initial trauma. In other words, he or she is still someone who does not morph from a good guy to a bad guy. But dark drama, the way we're starting to define it now, I think, questions that idea of psychological horror. I've mentioned in an earlier video that the idea of the monster that festers inside is, for me, at least, the heart of tragedy. Now, today we don't consider tragedy as a genre the way the ancient Greeks did. It hasn't seemed to be relevant in the same ways. But, as per my thoughts about Breaking Bad, I wonder if tragedy is reemerging as an important narrative theme today, if for no other reason than it wants to explain why people turn from suffering victims to active antagonists. Consider Shakespeare's Macbeth as a classic tragedy. Here's a successful warrior suffering with what British sociology Anthony King considers classic battle PTSD, trauma of the first order, who goes through a period of extremely bad moral decisions, murdering first King Duncan to ascend to the throne, then having his general Banquo killed, slaughtering Macduff's family, and finally he's beheaded by Macduff himself. Ruin and destruction, all sparked by the trauma of war, but then abetted by a terrible failure of moral judgment. Consider as well It Comes at Night, which begins from a place of extreme trauma, unfolds with its protagonist, Paul, through increasingly unhinged and rabid paranoia, to his murdering one family and finally complete devastation of his own. Then there's The Witch, whose banished family is one by one killed off by the traumatized, compromised daughter. So I argue that The Orchard follows that same line. Here's a damaged young man who cannot surmount his trauma and must enact some form of retribution in the world. Does this all sound like a downer? Yes. But, as Aristotle notes, tragedy is designed to spark catharsis in the viewer. Catharsis, in this definition, is a kind of provoking of negative feeling in the audience, which, once it's expressed, can then be purged, leaving the viewer relieved. If this sounds weird, please note that Freudian psychoanalysis also deals in catharsis by unveiling hidden trauma and similarly revealing and releasing it. I'll talk a little more about the reemergence of tragedy in contemporary horror film in my next installment. In the meantime, you can view The Orchard for free on Tubi. I'll leave a link in our description below. And thank you as always for watching, for liking and subscribing. More later, dear watchers.